Quickly trying to follow up their hit in the arcades, Wonder Boy, Westone makes a sharp left turn and suddenly decides to develop an action RPG. This is Wonder Boy in Monsterland.
So picture this, you've just released a popular action platformer to arcades, and Sega is already working on its second conversion, this time for the Sega Master System. Hudson Soft in that time has their own take on your game out on the Famicom and MSX. It's also doing well, and will be on the US shores any day now. So you get busy on your sequel and you decide on a slower arcade-style RPG.
Well, this is kind of what happened with Escape, now officially called Westone, when they decided Tom Tom should drop his stone hatchet and pick up a sword.
Wonder Boy and Monsterland hit arcades only 1 year after the original Wonder Boy and made it to the Sega Master System in 1988. Originally, the arcade never officially made it to the US, leaving only the Master System version for anyone not in Japan. As far as I can tell, it is unknown exactly why Westone went this direction. It wouldn't be crazy to think, based on the fast timeline, that they already had the game cooked up in some form and just slapped the Wonder Boy name on it. Honestly, it would make a bit of sense that way. Despite the Wonder Boy tie-in and everyone calling it a sequel, the original Japanese release has nothing that directly ties it to the original game. The story just mentions a young and valiant hero named Book, yes, Book, who sets off to save the day after an evil dragon led a bunch of monsters to conquer the place now called Monsterland. Things get a bit muddier once we move to the international releases. Suddenly our hero is Bak Lee Temjin, whose nickname is Tom Tom, sort of very clearly bringing everything together. It is now 11 years after that fight with the king and saving your girlfriend Tina, who used to be named Tanya. Names are apparently very hard in the Wonder Boy universe.
Super Wonder Boy, Monster World. Sega!
At the core, Monsterland is a completely different experience than the original Wonder Boy. It is a weird mix where arcade action, platforming, and RPGs meet in a way that probably shouldn't work, but it kinda does. As the hero, you'll be traveling through Monsterland in very condensed set pieces. These rounds are the core of that arcade experience. They do get lengthier towards the end, starting to further blur the lines of the console experience, but the way the levels scroll and scenes change with no overworld to speak of still feels more at home in the arcades compared to what we would start seeing in platforming games such as the US version of Super Mario Bros. 2, or even in other action RPGs such as The Adventure of Link, which was already out in Japan. Both released in the US the same year as Monsterland. This is further helped along with other gameplay elements, a big one being the timer. Probably the biggest connection to the original Wonder Boy is another ticking down timer. Though this one is not controlled by our hero's hunger. Food won't keep anything going. This is just a mechanism to keep the game moving at a certain pace. Also, unlike other games to include a level timer, this isn't a player-controlled challenge or bonus for being able to traverse the level quickly. 1 hourglass is not enough to get through any level, not even the first one. You will need to make sure you find hidden hourglasses in the level, defeat bosses, and even stop in a pub or two. Fail to do these and you will lose a heart and maybe get a game over entirely. Speaking of getting a game over, there are no continues in the Master System version. The game was designed to be another arcade quarter muncher, so they adjusted that for the home release by giving you one attempt to successfully traverse the game world, defeat plenty of enemies, and the final boss. There isn't even a secret continue or a password system, and you don't just get penalized for using it, you get one single try.
Luckily, the game is pretty short, only spanning 12 rounds in the Master System version and 11 in the original arcade version, only equaling about 1 hour of gameplay, so you don't have to worry about completing a 20-hour epic just for it all to vanish.
Despite all these arcade mechanics, the game does well with its take on the RPG gameplay, as simplified as they are. Our hero starts off basically nude with no weapon or defense, though it's quickly given one by a friendly NPC in the first door you see, something that feels a little reminiscent of The Legend of Zelda. But unlike other games in the genre, the hero doesn't level up by experience points or by collecting gear and magical items from completing dungeons. While you'll occasionally come across a sword by defeating a sub-boss, most of the progression is controlled by an in-game economy. Turns out Monsterland is very capitalistic, and while a few other characters are happy to help the hero defeat the dragon, most want your coins before they will give you even the most basic of boots to protect your feet while trying to save everyone. But these shops and their owners are the only way you'll succeed in saving Monsterland. You'll need to learn to be decisive, because some shops will close to you if you window shop too long, and almost all of them will close after you have made your purchase. Others are even hidden too. They aren't making saving Monsterland very easy. At least they never try to sell you gear you already have. You also better try grabbing every coin you can. They exist in the trees, the clouds, enemies drop them, and bosses drop a lot. Pro tip, grab the money before you ever grab a key, as doing so will kick you out of the arena immediately. You also have a few other items and magic to round out that arsenal. The items such as a gauntlet, helmet, wing boots, and the cloak, the last one called the mysterious mantle for some reason, are all random and temporary. For example, if an enemy randomly drops a gauntlet, you get a little more attack power for a short amount of time. The cloak will make you invisible for a short time, so on and so forth. Magic has a limited amount of uses, but unlike later games in the series, I don't find them as useful as they are much more sparse anyway. In the arcade version, all these items would be displayed on the side, where in the Master System version, you need to view these on the pause screen. But it serves no purpose, you never equip anything. It just becomes part of your inventory and character once you pick it up. Plus, on the SMS version, you need to stand up and walk all the way to the console to hit that pause button, and nobody wants to do that. But cleaning up the HUD and moving everything to the top of the screen while also removing much of the text pop-ups was a great improvement over the arcade version. Obviously, Monsterland is a much slower experience than the original Wonder Boy, and platforming while present is now very basic and certainly not skill-based, or at least it isn't most of the time. Something I've complained about with Wonder Boy and Monster World on the Sega Genesis are the really terrible attempts to add platforming challenges. Well, this is where that originated from. A simple moving platform is one thing, but suddenly throwing in trickier situations like towards the end here can really ruin what was a fun playthrough. But if I had one real complaint for Monsterland, it would be the combat in general. The reach of that sword, and no matter which sword you get later, is all over the place. I'm never exactly sure where the hitbox is. Not only that, but with every upgrade, the enemies around you are scaling with that sword you should be carrying, so you rarely feel powerful in any scenario. That looming game over makes this fact even more stressful. When you face bosses, they tend to be much larger, spastic, or just fly well above your head, sometimes needing you to try some fancy footwork or strategize to land a hit, knowing full well you may miss entirely and just be hit yourself. On top of all that, it isn't exactly the most responsive sword swing. It isn't really lag, but there also isn't really any great feedback or timing to your sword swings. Finally, to put a bow on the RPG Lite style elements smashed into an arcade game, you have the point system. Like any proper arcade game, almost every action awards you points, collecting coins, killing monsters, killing them again and grabbing a random item rather than the usual coin, defeating bosses, and so on and so forth. At the end of each level, your heart level is counted down into points and is refilled accordingly as well. These points serve double duty and has our hero gain an extra heart as you reach certain milestones, essentially leveling them up and making the game a little easier. The selection of enemies and bosses in Monsterland is a mixed bag to be sure. A lot of the basic level enemies, especially early on, pose no real threat outside of the poor attack letting you down. The goblins being the only early game enemies that have an attack that feels like it presents a fair challenge that you can strategize around. Later enemies feel a little cheap, such as the never-stopping rats or the weird plant monsters that never stop firing pellets at you in all directions, and the stupid mud guys who are nearly impossible to hit. Others just feel crazy on balance and take way too many hits to take care of. The bosses, on the other hand, are mostly fine, and their biggest threat to the hero is being their size, and if they actually have an attack or something surrounding them. Only one is a complete cheap shot, and that is the Sphinx. If you manage to get the answer to the riddle from the bartender in the pyramid, an odd place to open a bar I must say, then you're golden. The Sphinx just lets you pass. But that doesn't always work, and that gives you only one option to guess. Guess wrong, and you must fight the Sphinx, and he's almost impossible to beat at this stage of the game. I'm sure you've noticed by now that the connection to the original Wonder Boy isn't really there visually either. You could say some bits still exist that feels like the same series, but even that feels like a stretch. That certainly isn't to say the visuals are lacking at all. They might not be the most impressive visuals, but they looked good on the 8-bit system and certainly in the arcade. Character portraits in the shops and such are actually very nice for the time. I'd say the only real negative is how small everything is, especially when dealing with the arcade game and its massive HUD on the left-hand side. Music and sound design are fine. Depending on the version you are playing, you might enjoy the songs more or less. The SMS version has a more muted tone with more low end on a lot of the mixes and a lot of more of the bleep and bloop type sounds, especially on the non-FM versions of the Master System. In the SMS version, again, there are only a few songs. There used to be separate themes for the cave and the castle in the arcade version, for example. But considering the length of the game, I don't blame them for just recycling a few tracks. But a few are really fun, and you'll probably find yourself humming at least the town tune or the title track. Wonder Boy in Monsterland was a weird transitional title. It tried to stay friendly to its arcade roots, but also took a very straightforward platforming title and attempted to make it an action RPG. There are some flaws, of course. The arcade aspect betrays the fun of the RPG gameplay, even as simplified as it is. And it wouldn't change the entire game to not feel rushed by removing the timer, and the challenge wouldn't change much at all. I'd also argue that despite some combat issues and the lack of continues on the home conversion, the arcade original is incredibly unbalanced in comparison, making the SMS version just a bit more fun to play. But overall, Wonder Boy in Monsterland is fun. If you learn the game, it is one of those perfect titles to revisit over and over again, because it doesn't take a lot of your time and there's always the possibility of things just not going to plan. Several versions of Monsterland exist, such as on the MSX, Amiga, and ZX Spectrum. Obviously, we've already talked about the arcade and SMS version, but there are two versions of real note that exist on the PC Engine and Nintendo Famicom. Of course, in typical Wonder Boy fashion, both of them were reskinned to be another franchise. Hudson gets another Wonder Boy title under its belt in Bicky Curryman World, a straight port that just changed some designs and characters to fit into the Bicky Curryman universe, which apparently started as a candy and later became a manga and anime series. Sayuki World was developed by NMK and released by Jaleco for the Famicom. Changing most of the game to be based on the classic story Journey to the West, the book, aka Tom Tom, was now changed to Son Goku, and the timer was removed completely. People in the US might find this similar to a game called Wampum, a very weird localization attempt of Sayuki World's sequel. Of course, Wonder Boy would double down on the action RPG genre in 1989 with the sequel Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap. But in 1988, the much less talked about game, also claiming to be Monster World 3, would hit arcades. So that is Wonder Boy in Monsterland, a fun game that is overshadowed by the other games in the series simply because those focused on one thing and did them well, while one could say Monsterland did too much and was a bit messy because of it. If you're looking for ways to play the game right now, you can actually play the original arcade version on the Nintendo Switch. A loose cart for the Sega Master System still isn't a terrible price either.
It is definitely a game that I would recommend to most. It's short and presents an interesting challenge, and it's a great look at the early days of the genre. We'll continue our journey through the Wonder Boy franchise soon, but until then, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.